Ontario's rental market has just been turned completely upside down. A new bill from Doug Ford's government, Bill 60, just passed on November 24, 2025, and it could unleash the fastest wave of evictions the province has ever seen. This isn't some minor regulatory update. It's a fundamental rewriting of the rules that govern the relationships between millions of tenants and their landlords. Protesters have been chanting "people over profit" in the public gallery as the vote passed, a clear sign of the tension surrounding the legislation. The bill's official name is the Fighting Delays Building Faster Act 2025, and its stated goal is to streamline a backlogged system. But what it really does is dramatically accelerate the eviction process, creating a new reality for anyone who rents a home in this province. So whether you are a tenant worried about keeping your home or a landlord fed up with a broken and delayed system, you need to know what just went down. These aren't minor tweaks, they are foundational changes to the rules of the game. Today, we are breaking down the most shocking changes that every tenant and landlord in Ontario needs to understand right now. We are going to cover the faster eviction clock, a controversial pay-to-play rule for hearing, the slashed appeal window, and a new loophole for personal use evictions that could have a massive impact. Let's get into it. First up, the timeline for evicting a tenant for non-payment of rent has been put on hyperspeed. Let's talk about the problem this was designed to solve, at least from the government's and landlords' point of view. For years, landlords have complained that the process for dealing with tenants who don't pay rent is painfully slow, costing them thousands in lost income and mortgage payments while they wait months for a hearing. The government argues these delays discourage people from becoming landlords, which in turn shrinks the province's already tight rental supply. So what's Bill 60's solution? It's all about a faster start to the formal process. Before, after rent was late, a landlord would serve an N4 notice and the tenant had 14 days to pay the arrears before the landlord could even apply for a hearing at the Landlord and Tenant Board or LTB. Bill 60 has chopped that timeline in half. Now a landlord can apply to the LTB just 7 days after serving the N4 notice. To be perfectly clear on how this works, let's say rent is due on December 1st. If it isn't paid, the landlord can serve the N4 notice on December 2nd. Under the old rules, the landlord had to wait until December 16th to file with the LTB. Now, if the rent is still missing by December 9th, the landlord can immediately file an L1 application. They no longer have to wait out that full 14-day period. The formal legal process can now officially begin twice as fast. For tenants, the implication is huge. That 14-day window was a critical buffer. It was time to sort out a delayed paycheck, find emergency funds for a sudden car repair, or recover from an illness without the immediate threat of a formal eviction filing landing on your doorstep. Now, that buffer is practically gone. A small temporary money problem that could have been resolved in 10 days can now escalate into a formal LTB case in just over a week, creating an insane amount of stress and legal pressure. For landlords, though this is a big win, it directly addresses their long-standing complaints about losing money from non-paying tenants. Filing with the LTB a week sooner means they might get a hearing date faster and either get the rent they are owed or regain possession of their property much more quickly, cutting their financial losses on mortgage, tax, and utility payments. It's a change that completely alters the pace and pressure of the eviction process from day one. The second major change is probably the most controversial one. It's a new rule that tenant advocates are calling pay-to-play system. and it dramatically changes a tenant's ability to defend themselves at a non-payment hearing. The problem, as framed by the government and landlord groups, was a common delay tactic at the LTB. They claimed that some tenants facing eviction for unpaid rent would wait until the hearing date to bring up completely different issues like months-old maintenance problems or claim landlord's harassment. This would often get the hearing adjourned for being unprepared to address new issues, causing more delays and costing landlords even more money. Bill 60 solution is a sledgehammer. The new law says that tenants at a non-payment hearing cannot raise other issues like disrepair or safety concerns unless they have given prior notice and paid at least 50% of the rent arrears the landlord is claiming. Think about what that means in the real world. Let's say you have been withholding rent because your landlord has ignored a serious mold problem for months, making your child's asthma worse and your home unsafe. The landlord files for eviction saying you owe $4,000. Under the old rules, you could go to the hearing and present your evidence about the mold as the reason for withholding rent. Now, under Bill 60, you are barred from even raising the mold issue at the hearing unless you first pay the landlord at least $2,000, half of what they allege you owe. This creates a brutal catch-22. If you don't have the money to pay rent in the first place, how are you supposed to be magically coming up with 50% of the arrears just to earn the right to talk about unsafe living conditions? It essentially makes your ability to access justice dependent on your ability to pay. Critics argue this silences the most vulnerable tenants and removes their primary leverage to force landlords to do necessary and legally required repairs. From the landlord's perspective, this is a key tool to stop people from abusing the system. It ensures that hearings about non-payment of rent stay focused on that single issue. It prevents what they see as a last-minute, frivolous claims from derailing the process, leading to a much faster and, for them, fairer resolution. The third major change is another acceleration of the legal process. This time, at the very end, the appeal. The time you have to challenge the LTB decision has been cut in half. The government's reasoning here is once again all about fighting delays. They argue that the appeals process, officially called a request for review, was just another avenue to drag out an eviction. Even after the LTB issued a formal eviction order, a tenant could file for a review, allowing them to stay in the unit for another month or more while the request was processed, often without merit in the eyes of landlords. Bill 60 solution is blunt and simple. It shortens the window to request a review of an LTB decision from 30 days down to just 15. The implication for tenant is a dangerously short timeline to seek justice. 15 days is an incredibly tight turnaround to react to a life-changing decision like an eviction. In that 2-week period, a tenant who's likely in crisis mode, possibly working multiple jobs, and may have limited access to resources, has to find and fully understand the legal decision, get advice from an already overwhelmed legal aid system, gather any new evidence, and properly draft and file the review request. For many, this compressed time frame will be an impossible hurdle, effectively preventing them from correcting a potentially wrong or unfair LTB decision. For landlords, this change brings something they have wanted for a long time, finally. A shorter review period means an eviction order becomes solid and enforceable much faster. It dramatically cuts down on the uncertainty and financial strain of a tenant remaining in a property long after an order has been issued. This change helps deliver the faster, more decisive outcomes that landlords argue are necessary for a healthy and predictable rental market. Okay, this is a lot, and it's understandably stressful. These are huge shifts with the real-world consequences. Before we get to the next big change, if you are finding this breakdown useful and want to stay informed on the chaotic Ontario housing market, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button. My goal is to give you the clear, unbiased information you need, and your support is what makes that possible. Now, let's talk about N12 evictions. The fourth big change creates a new and significant loophole for one of the most common no-fault evictions, the N12, or personal use eviction. This is when a landlord evicts a tenant so that they or a close family member can move in. The problem this change addresses from a landlord's perspective was a direct cost. Under the old rules, when a landlord issued an N12 notice, they were required to pay the tenant 1 month's rent as compensation to help with the cost of moving. Landlords, especially smaller ones, argued this was an unfair financial penalty when they genuinely needed their property back for their own family. Bill 60 creates a very specific but major loophole. Landlords are now exempt from paying that 1 month's rent in compensation if they give the tenant at least 120 days notice and the eviction date lines up with the end of the lease term. The old option of giving 60 days notice with 1 month's compensation still exists, but this new 120 days option removes the payment requirement entirely. For tenants, this means losing a critical financial safety net. In today's incredibly expensive rental market, that 1 month's compensation was often the only thing that made it possible for an evicted tenant to afford first and last month's rent for a new and likely more expensive place. Losing that cushion can be devastating. Think about it. A security deposit for a new apartment can be thousands of dollars, plus moving truck cost, utility connection fee, and lost wages from taking time off to move. 4 months' notice doesn't help pay those upfront costs if you can't save up the money. This turns a no-fault eviction into a potential housing crisis for a family. For landlords, this is a clear financial win. It makes it cheaper and easier to reclaim their property for legitimate personal use. For a landlord who is in a tough financial spot themselves and needs to move back into their own unit, not having to pay an extra month's rent can make a huge difference. This change gives them more flexibility and removes a cost they have long felt was unfair. With all these huge and frankly scary changes, it's also important to talk about what hasn't changed. In the middle of all this chaos, some core tenant protections are still in place, and it's vital to know them. First and most importantly, Bill 60 did not get rid of rent control for most units. For rental units first occupied before November 15, 2018, the annual rent increase guideline still applies. For 2025, that increase is capped at 2.5%, and for 2026, it is capped at 2.1%. Your landlord can't just triple your rent to get you out. However, if your unit is in a building that was first occupied after November 15, 2018, you are not protected by this cap. Second, landlords still need a valid legal reason to evict a tenant. Just cause eviction is still the law in Ontario. They can't just decide they don't like you and kick you out. They have to serve the correct LTB form for an approved reason, like not paying rent or personal use. Bad faith eviction, like claiming personal use and then immediately re-renting the unit for a higher price, are still illegal and carry heavy fines. Third, your landlord's basic responsibilities haven't changed. They are still required by law to keep your rental unit in a good state of repair and provide essential services like heat and water. Bill 60 affects your ability to use maintenance issues as a defense in a non-payment hearing, but it doesn't remove your fundamental right to a safe and well-maintained home. Finally, your privacy is still protected. Landlords must give proper notice before entering your unit. These core rights are the foundation of the Residential Tenancies Act, And while Bill 60 has aggressively changed the procedures around them, the rights themselves are still the law. So, what's the final call on Bill 60? It really depends on who you ask. The Ford government and landlord groups see this as a necessary course correction. They argue that speeding up a broken and backlogged LTB system, they are creating a more efficient and profitable market. So what's the final call on Bill 60? It really depends on who you ask. The Ford government and landlord groups see this as a necessary course correction. They argue that by speeding up a broken and a backlogged LTB system, they are creating a more efficient and predictable market. This, they claim, will encourage investment, boost rental supply, and eventually lead to more housing. For them, this is about fixing delays and restoring balance. But tenant advocates see this bill as a total disaster, calling it a massive step backward. They see it as a law that systematically guts renter protection and creates a high-speed pipeline to eviction. They warn that these changes will hurt the most vulnerable people, seniors, single parents, low-income families, and newcomers, and will almost certainly lead to a rise in housing instability and homelessness. The real question at the heart of this is a philosophical one. Is housing a commodity or a human right? Will making it easier, faster, and cheaper to evict tenants actually solve a housing crisis? Or will it just make having a stable home more precarious and push more people into crisis without ever addressing the root problems of low supply and skyrocketing unaffordability? One thing is for sure, for the millions of renters and landlords in Ontario, the ground has just shifted beneath their feet. The timelines are shorter, the stakes are higher, and being prepared and informed is more important than ever. What do you think? Is Bill 60 a necessary step to fix a broken system? Or is it a devastating blow to renters' rights? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to stay on the top of this rapidly changing situation, make sure you subscribe for more updates on the Ontario housing market. Thanks for watching.